Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 245. Handling Introvert-Extravert conflicts. I need to start this episode by declaring my hand, or my paradoxical hands as it happens. On the one hand, I'm not a lover of conflict, and I certainly don't engage in it for sport. I know many who do, and all I can think of is what a waste of time and energy. Conflict, when it bubbles into anger, frightens me. Who knew I was such a delicate soul? On the other hand, I did warn you about my paradoxical hands. I know that conflict, when approached with emotional maturity and intelligence, isn't a bad thing. It can be the source of creativity and is essential if we are to be real with each other. What I love helping people with is disagreeing constructively and productively rather than angrily. I've not seen where anger has a better outcome than rational adult conversations, because frankly, anger is not win-win territory. And in this episode, I'm exploring some of the most commonly encountered supposed conflicts between introverts and extroverts, and how we can approach these as rational adults. I have another declaration here. Extroverts are not my enemy. They never have been and they never will be. They are doing what they need to do to recharge their batteries and be their best selves, just as we are. The reality is we need different things, but that doesn't make them my enemy. That's because I'm about inclusion, not further division. There's already too much of that in the world. And when differences are not respected and approached as conflictual, I have a problem. It's actually really present for me right now as I caught up with my dear bro Paul on Saturday after my accountability day. He's never lived so close to me, and it's a real treat to be able to just pop in for a quick catch-up. I used to have to jump on a plane or drive several hundred miles. Not anymore. Anyway, when I arrived on Saturday, he told me that he'd been invited to a party but wouldn't be going. Now, Paul is an open and engaging introvert as per the introvert type questionnaire, and not really a fan of parties. We talked it through and I teased him quite a lot as he was mimicking the boring small talk that he would have to tolerate. After much toing and froing, Paul decided he would go to the party just for a short while. Anyway, he sent me a couple of pics and voice notes from the party, which sounded absolutely buzzing. One of his messages was this. The host, whose birthday it was, gave a speech and mentioned that he always wondered if he was an introvert, and now he realises that he's an introverted introvert. I bet quite a few of us can relate to that. Anyway, one of his guests then gave a reply along the lines of, "Well, we'll have to sort that out, won't we?" Paul was chuckling as he relayed this story to me and said he was so offended and thought, well, F you. So that's a classic case of the existence of the bias towards the extrovert ideal in society, plus a point of potential conflict in a friendship. People still genuinely think there's something wrong with being an introvert and that they have the right to comment about making us better. Better for who is my question. Certainly not better for me. We shouldn't have to justify our quiet nature and put up with people in public settings implying that there is something wrong with us that needs fixing. We do not need sorting out or mending or your help to be more like you. This got me thinking about what other common conflicts we might face on a regular basis. And as you might imagine, it didn't take long for a whole heap of things to bubble up. So I'm going to focus on issues that arise in professional settings in this episode, although as you might expect, there are many overlaps between the professional and personal. Number 1, meeting dynamics. Typically, this includes how the meeting is organised and run. Extroverts are happy to initiate and attend spontaneous meetings, whereas spontaneity like this catches most introverts off guard. How can they prepare so they can contribute fully? Any conflicts here are likely to be rather one-sided though, as all too often introverts are simply not given airtime or heard. If any of you remember Bruce Tuckman's stages of group development, we know that storming comes after forming and before norming, and it usually signifies that the group or team are progressing. However, if the storming happens by withdrawing rather than challenging and being honest with our opinions, we're in danger of presenting false harmony. Then, of course, there tends to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were, and everyone is shocked. Why? Because the reaction seems out of proportion and no one saw it coming. That's why chairing a meeting is a really skilled job, but hardly anyone gets that kind of training anymore. The second area of conflict is around office layout. Many businesses changed the square footage of their offices after lockdown, so many are now hot desking. This has its advantages and disadvantages for we introverts. If we get stuck with the jocks, the noisy brigade who spend all day joking around, that will disrupt my equilibrium and I'll be less productive. As a result, my stress levels will rise as my to-do list refuses to decrease. My well-being may suffer, and then I'll want to work from home more in order to get my work done. Oh, hang on. That's right. I'm not trusted to work from home anymore. If I can book a quiet pod, I'll get more done, although I'll face being called antisocial. Sticks and stones, my friend. Sticks and stones. Why would I take seriously the juvenile name-calling by someone I wouldn't turn to for advice? Nah. The third type of conflict could be around our communication styles. I've talked about this so often, yet it's still the thing that tends to have the biggest impact with people. We introverts have a think, say, think communication process, so when asked for our input, we like to consider our answer fully. We'll often wait patiently for someone else to finish what they're saying so that we can contribute. But often our desire to add to the conversation goes unnoticed. Extroverts tend to have a say, think, say communication process, so it's more a stream of consciousness that they make sense of as they go. They're rarely attached to what they've said and may not even remember it. These two styles are hardly complementary and are often the source of tension and resentment from an introvert's perspective. The same is not true for the extrovert, as they said what was on their mind. The fourth area of conflict is leadership. I know I'm in danger of generalising here, but it seems that introverts are much more likely to be servant leaders or those that lead from within rather than the out-front command and control type leaders. There's no real issue with either. It's more about what's right and people's perception. Old school leaders and managers were more used to the old military model, which hinges on obedience and authority. As you might imagine, those in this camp may not perceive the servant leadership as strong enough, And it can be why we as introverts are not considered leaders. These days, we're much more likely to talk about and coach people in the empowerment that comes from enabling people to reach their full potential through servant leadership. Whichever you choose, make sure you know why you're using that style, check that it's right for the situation, and that it reflects the authentic you. The fifth and final area I'm looking at here is decision making. This is such an interesting area because we each have our own way of approaching problems and making decisions. I know that most of my introverted clients hate being rushed into a decision, so when forced, we're in danger of blind compliance at best. This is when we follow rules or orders without question, even when what we're being asked to do is ludicrous. I'd say many of we introverts are risk averse, relatively speaking anyway, so we want time to do our homework and thoroughly research something before making our decisions. I know this causes conflict, albeit low-grade conflict, from the more extroverted personalities who get frustrated with what they call us dragging our feet. My question is, why wouldn't you be curious about somebody's hesitation? I know I would. But I guess that's the difference between leaders who do just enough, tick boxes, but really only pay lip service to the important issues. Well, it's high time we leaders take our responsibilities seriously and go beyond lip service. And as employees and members of society, it's time to hold our leaders to account so they know what we expect of them. It's time for real action, not to divide and conquer, but to include and empower. Talking of holding people to account, I suggest we start with ourselves. In fact, I think we should always start by honestly looking at ourselves and making sure we're looking more than skin deep. We would do well to explore where the idea of conflict originates from, where the good versus bad rather than just different started. I know that for me it was part of my upbringing and a mix of the stories I was told, the stories I read myself, and those I made up to make sense of the world. There's no doubt that stories play a big part in forming our beliefs about ourselves and the world we inhabit. Humans have always been storytellers. It's how traditions, cultures and lessons were originally passed on. What started as carvings and cave writings evolved into written texts, books, TEDx platforms and podcasts like this one, all designed to help us understand and relate so that we might resolve our misunderstandings. And even legends, fables and traditional fairy tales teach how conflict can be best resolved. So my big question is, how can we rewrite the stories that no longer serve us? Maybe they never did, but we blindly believed what we heard or read. How can we begin to appreciate and value our differences as the creative spark they could be? I believe this is possible when we create new, compelling and positive stories that reveal the learnings from the past and support where we collectively need to be going now. Just imagine if our stories helped to build meaningful relationships where our differences were celebrated, not weaponized, where empowerment was as natural as breathing, and where we made time for each other with grace and kindness in our hearts. Would you read that story? I know I would, which is why I'm going to start writing that story for our next episode. There is real power in storytelling after all. So let's reframe conflict for ourselves because we're the only ones we have any control over. And when we model to others how conflict can be faced gently and with empathy and compassion, it ceases to be scary. And that's a great start. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.